The night the last candle flickered out in the old family estate, the wind carried with it a whisper. It spoke of lives that should have ended decades, even centuries ago. But somehow they didn't. 10 generations, each one carrying a thread of a story that defied everything we understand about survival, about fate, about the very nature of life itself. They lived while others died. They thrived while history seemed determined to erase them. And when you look closer at the family records, at the cryptic diaries hidden in the attic and the barely legible letters yellowed with time, a pattern emerges, one that chills the spine and refuses to let go. Historians have tried to make sense of it. Sociologists have dismissed it as coincidence. But coincidence doesn't account for the staggering number of tragedies this family survived. Fires, plagues, disappearances that swallowed entire communities, yet left them untouched. The first recorded ancestor arrived on American soil in the early 1700s, a man who should have perished on the voyage, buried at sea like so many others. He didn't. And from there, each successive generation seemed to cheat death in ways that made even the most rational minds question reality. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What's remarkable isn't just survival. It's the darkness that shadows it. Every family member carried with them a quiet terror, a sense that living was only part of the equation. And each story, when examined closely, reveals a truth that is as unnerving as it is inexplicable. A child who vanished for a week, only to return speaking of unseen worlds. A mother whose eyes reflected knowledge no human should possess. A patriarch who walked through a fire and emerged unscathed, yet bore scars invisible to the world. As we delve deeper, the patterns of their survival become almost ritualistic, as though the family had unlocked a hidden law of endurance that no one else could grasp. But with that survival came consequences. Shadows that clung to their souls, secrets that festered in silence, and a legacy that was as much a curse as it was a miracle. The more you examine the records, the more the line between fact and nightmare blurs, and it is precisely in that blur where the story of 10 generations begins to reveal itself layer by layer until the truth is too heavy to ignore. If you thought history was only about what was written in textbooks, think again. Some stories were never meant to be found. Some truths were never meant to be spoken, and this is one of them. This is the family that shouldn't have survived, and the shadows they left behind. The second generation didn't simply inherit land or wealth. They inherited the weight of survival itself. Records from the late 1700s show a family house that burned to the ground in the dead of winter, leaving dozens of neighbors dead. Yet not a single member of this family perished. How they escaped remains a mystery. The accounts are contradictory, often written in the shaky hand of terrified witnesses who could barely comprehend what they saw. Some claimed they vanished into the smoke, emerging hours later as if the fire had no effect. Others whispered of darker explanations, of pacts and protections that cannot be explained in any rational sense. But survival came with an odd, almost imperceptible change in the family itself. Diaries from that era reveal a growing detachment from the world around them, a silence that was more than mere grief. Children spoke to shadows, women hummed tunes that no one else could hear, and men recorded dreams so vivid and violent they often awoke in cold sweat, shaking with fear at visions no one else could understand. There was a recurring symbol in these writings, a circle, intersected by lines, repeated on paper scraps, etched into the margins of letters, carved into wood. Its meaning is lost, but it seems tied to the uncanny longevity that marked the bloodline. Observers at the time were both fascinated and terrified. Town records describe neighbors who refused to walk past the family property at night, reporting strange lights and unidentifiable sounds. Visitors claimed that sometimes the house itself seemed to breathe, a living thing that guarded the inhabitants. Even clergy were called, but prayers and blessings did not drive away the sense of unnatural preservation that clung to the family. And yet, despite the fear and suspicion, they continued to thrive, multiplying, spreading their presence quietly across the region, leaving a trail of whispered stories that were never written down, except in the fragments we now piece together. Each family member seemed to carry a fragment of memory that no one else could access, knowledge that was too old, too painful, too anomalous. And the more they lived, the more isolated they became, not just from society but from themselves. Their letters to one another, when preserved, are haunting. Conversations that make no sense, warnings that read like prophecy, and promises of endurance that no human life should logically fulfill. The more you examine it, the more you realize this family existed under a different set of rules. Rules that defied mortality itself. It is in this second generation that the pattern starts to solidify. The combination of inexplicable survival, emotional detachment, and ominous premonitions. And as we move to the third generation, the story only deepens, taking a darker, more unnerving turn. The secrets of survival were no longer merely a matter of luck. They were becoming something almost intentional, something that demanded acknowledgement and dread. By the time the third generation came of age, whispers about the family had grown into a quiet terror that spread beyond the local towns. Outsiders spoke of them in hushed tones, as if saying their name aloud might summon something unseen. Letters preserved from this era described children who seemed to possess knowledge far beyond their years. Insights into events they could not have witnessed, an intuition about danger that bordered on the supernatural. Parents wrote of fear in the eyes of their own children, fear not of the world outside, but of the family itself, as if something within the bloodline carried a warning meant only for those who shared it. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from a small village doctor who was called to treat a young boy suffering from an illness that should have been fatal. The boy recovered with no explanation, not through medicine, not through care, but simply by being left alone in the family's presence. The doctor recorded his disbelief. It is as if they possess a shield, or the world itself refuses to touch them with death. I have seen no miracle like this, only a persistence that is unnatural. The phrase "unnatural persistence" would echo through time as future generations repeated it in hushed tones when confronted with the family's continued survival against impossible odds. Yet with life came shadows that could not be ignored. Letters and diaries reveal a growing obsession among the family members with rituals, some of which are only hinted at in fragmented sentences. "We do not sleep alone. The circle must be kept unbroken. He knows if we falter." There is no clear explanation for these cryptic statements, but the repetition of symbols, secrecy, and a near-religious reverence for continuity suggests a mindset that extended beyond survival. It suggests purpose, and while the outside world noticed the uncanny nature of their lives, the family itself seemed more focused on the inheritance of something far darker than land or money. Accounts from neighbors also take a sinister turn. Dogs refused to approach their property. Horses became skittish and refused to enter the yard. Children would wake screaming, unable to describe what they saw through the windows. Visitors reported cold spots, whispers in empty rooms, and fleeting shadows that moved with intention. The house, by now a multi-generational estate, seemed to grow with them, absorbing their energy, reflecting their fears, and sheltering their secrets. And though the family continued to thrive physically, the psychological weight they carried was immense, an invisible hand pressing on their very minds. By the end of the third generation, it becomes clear this is not merely a story of survival. It is a story of endurance that bends reality, a lineage that pushes against natural laws, a family that walks a line between life and something darker, something the rest of the world cannot comprehend. And as we move into the fourth generation, the pattern of unnerving, inexplicable events intensifies, revealing a truth that most would rather leave buried forever. The fourth generation marks a turning point, where survival begins to feel less like luck and more like a deliberate act, guided by forces that refuse to be named. Family journals from this period describe nights that stretched endlessly, children waking before sunrise with knowledge they could not have learned, and adults who seemed to anticipate tragedies that would strike elsewhere yet never touched them. Neighbors whispered that to know someone from this family was to glimpse a mirror of mortality that most could not endure. To live in proximity to them was to feel the cold inevitability of fate bending in their favor. It is during this era that the darker implications of their endurance become apparent. Accounts detail an obsession with lineage and purity, a ritualistic vigilance that extended beyond life into death itself. Graves were tended meticulously, with notes scrawled in languages long forgotten. Family members spoke of a duty not to the living, but to those who had come before, and those who would inevitably come after. There are hints that certain members were taken into hidden rooms or left alone for hours in the company of symbols, artifacts, and objects whose purpose was never recorded in any detail except for fleeting remarks like, "The blood must remember," or "We are bound by what cannot be named." At the same time, outside observers began to document the strange psychological effects that radiated from the family. Servants and neighbors reported intense anxiety, hallucinations, and dreams so vivid they could not be distinguished from waking life. There were stories of entire fields of crops failing while their property flourished, and animals, both domestic and wild, avoiding the estate as if compelled by instinct. Even in times of war, famine, or epidemic, the family's survival was total, bordering on impossible. Letters from outsiders speak of fear mixed with awe, a recognition that this was no ordinary household. But it is the internal dynamics of the family that reveal the most disturbing patterns. Children grew up with a dual awareness, the knowledge that they were protected in ways no one else could understand, and the dread that this protection came at a cost they could not yet name. Marriages were arranged with precision, seemingly guided by an unseen hand, as if each union was meant to reinforce an unspoken covenant. Diaries hint at lessons taught in whispers, exercises in endurance, and a philosophy that life itself was subordinate to the legacy they were tasked to maintain. By the fourth generation, survival had become an art form, but it was accompanied by an inescapable shadow. Those who thrived bore scars invisible to the eye, mental, emotional, and spiritual, and carried the weight of knowing that the line they were preserving had endured horrors the outside world could barely imagine. And as we approach the fifth generation, the story darkens further, as the family begins to realize that their remarkable longevity may not be a blessing at all, but a burden written into their very blood, a force that demands obedience, secrecy, and sacrifice. By the fifth generation, the weight of tenacious survival had begun to shape the family in ways outsiders could barely understand. Their longevity was no longer merely physical. It had become psychological, a presence that permeated every thought, every choice, every heartbeat. Diaries from this era are fragmented, but the fragments reveal an almost ritualistic obsession with continuity. Children were taught not only how to endure, but how to recognize patterns, to predict dangers, to act as if the world itself moved according to the rhythm of their blood. And in the shadows of these teachings lies the first hint that this endurance carried a price far darker than anyone had imagined. Outsiders who came into contact with the family at this time described an almost tangible aura, a coldness, a tension that hung in the air. Stories persist of visitors who entered the estate for innocent purposes, only to leave days later unrecognizable, drained, haunted by visions they could not explain. One particularly chilling account tells of a traveling merchant who offered supplies in exchange for shelter. By the next morning, he was found wandering in the woods, incoherent, pointing toward the house with a mixture of fear and reverence, muttering, "They are everywhere, they see everything, and they do not die." Such accounts, though anecdotal, are remarkably consistent across multiple towns, suggesting that something extraordinary and deeply unsettling radiated from this bloodline. Inside the family, there was a growing consciousness of power, of control, and of legacy. Letters hint at whispered warnings: "Do not falter, or the line suffers." Every action echoes through 10 lives. The past remembers us. It is almost as if each family member was aware that their survival was not a gift, but a covenant binding them to unseen rules and expectations. And with this awareness came isolation. Bonds with the outside world weakened. Trust became a currency they could not afford to spend. The more they thrived, the more alien they became, until even love and loyalty were filtered through the lens of preservation and endurance. And yet, even within this cold calculus, there are glimpses of fragility. Diaries speak of despair, of nightmares that clawed at the mind, of children who could not bear the knowledge they inherited. The family's survival, it seems, demanded not only adherence to cryptic rules, but the endurance of psychological torment that few outside could imagine. It is here that a question emerges, one that echoes through the centuries: is this survival a miracle, or is it a curse disguised as one? And if it is a curse, how much longer can it continue before it consumes them entirely? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because the truth is, by the fifth generation, the line is no longer simply surviving. It is actively shaping the world around it, bending reality in subtle, horrifying ways, and demanding sacrifices that the outside world would never understand. And the story is far from over. The sixth generation brings the first hints that survival is no longer enough. It must now be defended. By this time, the family estate had grown into a fortress of secrets, a labyrinth of hidden rooms, forbidden passages, and documents that chronicled horrors no outsider could comprehend. Letters speak of the elders instructing the young to memorize patterns of behavior, memorize hidden rotes, and, most importantly, memorize the faces of those who might threaten the line. Every action, every glance, every word carried weight. It was no longer merely about living. It was about ensuring the continuity of a legacy that had become larger than life, heavier than morality, and darker than anyone dared admit. Accounts from locals paint a disturbing picture. Travelers who wandered too close to the estate reported hearing voices calling from nowhere, glimpsing figures in the windows that seemed to watch their every move. Animals avoided the property entirely. Crops wilted near its edges while the gardens inside thrived unnaturally. Servants who stayed too long would vanish only to reappear days later, hollow-eyed and silent, as if some part of their spirit had been left behind. And through it all, the family remained untouched, unyielding and ever watchful, as if guided by knowledge too profound, too terrible for outsiders to understand. Inside the family, the psychological burden intensifies. The children of this generation were not simply educated. They were indoctrinated in survival as a moral imperative, in secrecy as a sacred duty, and in endurance as a defining trait of their very existence. Diaries from this era reveal chilling instructions: trust no one beyond the line. Remember the circle, for it protects us. Pain is fleeting. The line is eternal. The repetition of these phrases suggests a mindset that had shifted from mere preservation to obsession, a devotion to survival that bordered on worship. And with this devotion came isolation so complete that even the closest friendships could not penetrate it. The darker side of this survival emerges in whispers of violence. Records hint at unspoken punishments, disappearances, and confrontations that were never fully explained. Outsiders who questioned the family's methods were quickly silenced, sometimes through fear, sometimes through mysterious circumstances that left no trace. And yet, each act of darkness seems calculated, deliberate, and tied to an almost ritualistic purpose. Survival is no longer passive, it is active, and it exacts a toll that leaves invisible scars across generations. By the end of the sixth generation, it becomes clear the family's endurance is not a gift of nature, but a carefully guarded, almost supernatural force. They have learned to manipulate circumstance, to bend probability, and perhaps even to shape reality itself to ensure their survival. But this power comes at a price, and the questions that arise are unsettling. How far will they go to protect the bloodline? And how much of their humanity has already been sacrificed to ensure that the line continues unbroken? By the seventh generation, the family had become something that no one outside could fully comprehend. The line that had once merely survived now dominated its own reality, shaping life and death with a precision that bordered on the unnatural. Letters, diaries, and hidden journals describe a family that understood time and consequence in ways ordinary people could not. They spoke of events decades in advance, predicted calamities, and maneuvered through the world with a calm that was almost eerie, an understanding that they were not bound by the same rules as everyone else. Yet, with this power came an even heavier burden. The weight of centuries pressed down on them, and the psychological scars of survival had deepened into something almost pathological. Some members of the family were said to wander the halls in silence, whispering to shadows, speaking words that no one else could hear. Others became obsessed with rituals that seemed designed to tether life itself to the family bloodline. Their endurance was no longer merely a curiosity or a miracle. It had become a necessity, a mandate, a form of existence that demanded obedience at every level. Accounts from those who lived near the estate describe a chilling aura, as if the air itself had been altered by the presence of the family. Visitors reported disorientation, sudden fatigue, and a gnawing sense of dread that would not dissipate until they were miles away. Some claimed to see figures at the windows, staring with eyes that reflected knowledge beyond human comprehension. Animals continued to avoid the grounds, and strange phenomena, lights, sounds, movements were reported on a near-constant basis. The family existed as both part of and apart from the world, untouchable, omnipresent, and quietly terrifying. The records hint at a truth that is almost unbearable. This family may no longer be bound by mortality in the traditional sense. They have survived wars, epidemics, and disasters that claimed everyone around them, yet they endure. Each generation inherits not only the bloodline but a set of unseen laws, rituals, and knowledge that ensure its continuity. And while they thrive physically, the psychological and spiritual cost is immense, a burden so heavy that the line of descendants is as much a cautionary tale as it is a marvel. And now, as we reflect on 10 generations of survival, we are forced to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to endure? Is it a blessing, a miracle, or a curse so profound that it reshapes the very soul? The family that shouldn't have survived serves as a chilling reminder that some legacies are written not in ink, but in the unnatural persistence of life itself. We peer into their history not to judge, but to witness, a warning buried in the shadows, a truth that refuses to fade, a line of lives that defy understanding. And perhaps, in that defiance, we glimpse something we were never meant to see,